So for today, we are learning how to factor perfect square trinomials at 80% accuracy or higher. So first, in order to do that, you need to be able to recognize perfect square trinomials. You need to be able to factor them and to fill in missing terms in perfect square trinomials. Ren, close your Chromebook. All right, now we'll go over the warm-up here in just a second, but here are the video lessons. I always like to include some that I did not create because maybe you like the way that they explain things, but I will record the lecture like I'm doing right now and upload it later so that you can watch it again, or if you're ever absent, that's what I've been doing for a while now, so check those out. You have a puzzle piece practice today, so this isn't a 2-day lesson, it's just a 1-day lesson, so you have the puzzle piece afterward. It's only 5 problems, so it shouldn't be too bad, just practicing so that for the test. Now, here's the deadlines that are coming up all until spring break. So we have this week, next week, and then it's spring break. The only deadline this week right now is for late work from the purple folders in Schoology. So yesterday while you were testing, and I do still have a couple more that I need to pass out, I handed you your missing assignment report, and I highlighted stuff that falls under this deadline. So unless you were absent, you do get extra time if you were absent, but only equal to the amount of days that you were absent. So what was I going to say about that? So equal to the amount of days that you were absent. So if you were absent 5 days, you get until March 10th, right? So just keep that in mind. Otherwise, it falls under that category, and after that date, then you do not receive credit. You can still turn it in. It just won't help towards your grade unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstance that caused you to be more than 4 weeks late. Questions about the deadline? All right. And then we have the Module 8 test scheduled for next week, and it might even be moved up because we might take out the lesson for 8.07. We're still figuring that out. So we might have to move the test up, which will give us more time to do retakes on other tests before spring break. So I'll keep you updated on this situation when I find out. But you remember last semester when we did a bunch of retakes at the end of the year? Well, looking through the calendar up through the end of the year, we don't really have days to do that. So what we're trying to do is incorporate them throughout the semester, like right before spring break, we have 2 extra days. We're going to use those days to retake Module 4. And it's going to be mandatory unless you scored a 90% or higher. That way, at the end of the year, we won't have time to do retake, so we'll already have Module 4 taken care of. Does that make sense? All right, so just be aware of that. That's your opportunity next week, right before spring break. So now for today's lesson. I had you start with a warm-up. If you've noticed, this whole unit is basically working backwards, right? So right now we're starting with something that is already factored, and we need to simplify it. How can I simplify this? Expanding it. Good. I like that word, expanding it. So I've had some students think that they can just use the power rule. But because there's a minus sign in the middle, you cannot do that. So you do have to expand this. Becomes 3 minus a times 3 minus a. All right, that's what that square means. It means you're multiplying this by itself that many times. From here, how do I solve this?
FOIL.
FOIL or distribute, whichever one you like better. So if we FOIL and multiply the first terms, what's 3 times 3?
9.
The outer numbers, 3 times negative a. Good, always make sure that 3 goes in front or the number goes before the variable. Inner terms, what's negative a times 3?
negative
And the last term, negative a times negative a.
positive a
Good. Any like terms that we can combine?
and negative
Good. It's usually the middle terms whenever we FOIL. So those combine to give me plus a squared. All right, now the directions don't say to put it in standard form, but if you did, good job. We'll just leave it right here. Just make sure to read the directions if it wants it in a particular form. But good job. Now the second one. First step, we need to expand it. It becomes x plus 5 times x plus 5. This time I'll use the distributive property. So we'll distribute the x to both numbers. What's x times x? X squared. Outer number, or not outer numbers. X times 5. And now distribute the 5 to the other set of parentheses as well. So 5 times x is, and 5 times 5 is. Combine like terms, that middle term becomes 10x, because 5x plus 5x. And then we get x squared plus 10x plus 25. Good on that one. All right, the last one. This would be something that you would probably get after doing slide and divide, but still we expand it just like we did the other ones. 3x minus 2y times 3x minus 2y. This time we'll FOIL. What's 3x times 3x? Good. Don't forget the squared part. Outer numbers, 3x times negative 2y. Good. Inner numbers. And then the last numbers.
Positive 4y squared.
Good. I'm sorry, I kind of ran out of room, so I have to write it below. And then when we combine like terms, we get really close. Well, we get 9x squared, and then the middle term should be, and then plus 4y squared. Questions? All right. So if you've noticed with our warm-ups for this unit, I'm going to ask for the side chatter to stop. If you've noticed for the warm-ups for this unit, we go from factored form to simplified form, but in the lesson we go from, exactly, we go from simplified form to factored form. So we're going to learn how to go from this to this, which we already kind of learned with, slide and divide and the diamond method. But what's really cool about these ones is that they're what's called perfect square trinomials. So you might not have noticed, because it's probably the first time that you're seeing it, but the first and last terms of all of these are perfect squares. Right? What's the square root of 9? The square root of a squared. And then the rest of these are perfect squares as well. Because we have that, there is a simpler way to factor these, and that's what we'll be showing you today. So really, if you're struggling, you could just use the slide and divide method or whatever you're comfortable with. But I know not a big part, but a part of your test will be factoring perfect square trinomials or just identifying them. All right, so a couple definitions. A perfect square trinomial is a square of a binomial. So it's what we get when we multiply this out. And to see if it's a perfect square trinomial, you need to first check that the first and last terms are perfect squares. Good question. So the question was, how do you check that? take the square root of the first and the last terms. If you get a decimal, then it's not a perfect square. Or if it's like a cubed, I cannot get a perfect square out of that. All right, now the next thing is that the middle term has to be 2 times the roots of the first and last terms. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. But notice like when we FOILed this out, we got this twice. We got this twice. All right, so the middle term has to be 2 times the roots of the first 2 terms, or the first and last term. Questions about that so far? So this is the factored form for your perfect square trinomials. That's what your answers usually look like when you factor. But here's what they look like expanded. So a plus b times a plus b. FOIL that and simplify it. The simplified form looks like a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. All right, so that's your definition for when it's plus. All right, when it's minus, so expand it out, looks like this, a minus b times a minus b. We get a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. So the only difference between the 2 equations is the symbol on the middle term. All right, the first and last terms should be positive, and the middle term, it just depends on what your factor form was. So if you look at like the warm-up, notice when we FOILed it out, it was this twice, like the negative 3a is there twice. That's the root of the first term and the last term, but multiplied by 2. Does that make sense? So like this negative 6a is 3 times a times 2.
Okay.
You'll see more when we do a few examples. Any questions? All right, so, sorry, I have to move something. So let's look at this as an example. 16x squared plus 24x plus 9. So a big part of this is identifying your perfect square trinomials. So is 16x squared, is that a perfect square?
Yeah.
When I take my square root of it, what's the square root? What else? So that's the square root of 16. What's the square root of x squared? So we would say yes, the first term is a perfect square because 16x squared, or the square root of that, is 4x. All right, we'll do the middle term last. Is 9, or the last term, a perfect square?
Yes.
Yes, what's the square root of 9?
3.
3. So what I basically found out here is my a value is 4x and my b value is 3. That helps us figure out what the middle term should be for a perfect square trinomial. Since this is positive up here, then it has to be 2, a positive 2, times a times b. So if I do 2 times a, which is 4x, times b, which is 3, and I multiply that out, do I get 24x for the middle term? All I would agree. 2 times 4x is 8x. Times 3 is 24x.
Is that number always gonna be 2?
It's always going to be 2 times a times b. A good question. It's always going to be 2 times a times b. If this is a negative sign up here, then it'd be negative 2 times a times b. So yes, this is a perfect square trinomial. Question? All right, so scrolling down a bit. Down here for these examples, we'll do 3 together and then you'll try 3 on your own. We are going to determine if it's a perfect square trinomial, and if so, we're going to factor it. If it's not, we're just going to say why it's not. So this would be a good test question. So to figure out if number 1 is a perfect square trinomial, we're going to take the square root of the first term and the last term. What's the square root of 4y squared?
2.
2y. Good. What is the square root of 9?
3.
Now, we have our a value, we have our b value. Just letting you know this is a, this is b. Now we need to check the middle term. It's positive, so it's supposed to be 2 times a times b. So the 2 is positive. Anyone confused on anything we've done so far?
How do you get something like 2?
So it's the definition of what the middle term is supposed to be from up here.
So if it is a positive,
Then it's a positive 2ab. If it's minus, then it's negative 2ab. All right. So now plug in your a value and your b value and see if you do get that middle term. So I have 2 times a, which is 2y, times b, which is 3. And then you're checking when you multiply this out if you get this middle term. So 2 times 2y is, and then times 3 is, does that match up here?
Yeah.
Then yes, this is a perfect square trinomial. And here's how you write the factors. Writing the factors is super easy once you've done all that. It's just going to be your a value, which is 2y, plus your b value, which is 3, squared. And then I could check my answer by FOILing or distributing, but that's what I originally had. Questions? All right, so you really could do just slide and divide, but a big part of this is just identifying whether or not it's a perfect square trinomial. All right, so let's look at number 2. First step is to take the square root of the first term and the last term. What's the square root of 9x squared? Good, and the square root of 4? Good. So this is my a, this is my b. Now we need to check the middle term. Since it's negative in the problem, it needs to be negative 2 times a times b. So I'm negative 2 times a, which is 3x, times b, which is 2. When I multiply this out, do I get negative 6x? I do not, because when I do the first 2, I get negative 6x times 2. Then I get negative 12x. So no, this is not a perfect square trinomial. And if I had to say why, I would say middle term is not negative 2ab. It's not what we get when we do -2 times a times b. Questions? All right, one more together, and then you'll try some on your own. So we have number 3. What's the first step? Square root of the first term and the last term. Square root of 9y squared is, and the square root of 16 is, good. Now check the middle term. It's positive, so it should be a positive 2 times a times b. Plug in your a value, plug in your b value. When I multiply this out, do I get the middle term? All right, let's see. We get 6y times 4, which is 24y. That does match up. So this is a perfect square trinomial. So I would say, yes, this is a perfect square trinomial. And what would the factors be? Good. 3y plus 4 in parentheses squared is the factored form. Questions? All right, I'm going to try and scroll up as much as I can. So you have 3 problems on the back that say your turn. Try those out. You can work in your table groups, but the main point is just trying. If you're wrong, it's all right for right now. Yes, Jalen? All right, so let's see if you guys were correct. Is number 4 a perfect square trinomial?
Yeah.
So let's see, there's some disagreement. Take the square root of the first and the last term. What's the square root of 2a squared? 1 times 1 equals 1, not 2. So is there a perfect, is 2 a perfect square? No. All right, because 2 is not a perfect square. So if it's not a perfect square trinomial, you were supposed to say why. Because 2 is not a perfect square. Okay, boys. Number 5, is that one a perfect square trinomial?
Yes.
Yes, it is. What did you, well, let's kind of work it out. What's the square root of 4y squared? 2y. What's the square root of 9? 3. And then, since we know our a and b, and you guys probably figured this out too, 2ab. So 2 times 2y times 3 does equal 12. So then what are my factors?
2y plus 3.
Good. So once you've done all that, once you figured out what your a and b are, you kind of just smush them together into your factored form. All right, and I want to point this out. The sign that goes in your factored form depends on the sign on your middle term. So since it's positive on the middle term, it needs to be positive in my factored form. All right, number 6, is that a perfect square trinomial? All right, see a lot of shake heads, no. Why is it not?
Because 35 is not square.
Good, so this is not a perfect square. What, is there another reason why? So there's actually 2 reasons why. So 35 is not, hold on, let me erase a little bit. Negative 35 is not a perfect square. Also because it is Can I ever multiply something by itself and get a negative?
No.
So also because it is negative. So if this was a perfect square, like if it was minus 100, it's still not a perfect square trinomial because you can't have a negative as your last term. All right, it has to be positive. So like 10 times 10 gives me 100. Negative 10 times negative 10 gives me 100. There's no way I could get a negative 100. Make sense? All right, so good job. The other big part of this is being able to fill in these missing pieces. All right, so this is also on your puzzle piece practice. And in the direction, it tells us that these are all perfect square trinomials. Okay, sorry, the side chatter is really distracting. Okay, so these are all perfect square trinomials, and it tells you in the directions that it's either in this form where the middle term is positive or in this form where it's negative. So given what we know about perfect square trinomials, we can figure out these missing pieces. Essentially, all we need to figure out is what our A and B values are. So what's my A value?
1x.
Good. So square root of x squared is x. That means my A value is x. We are searching for the B value, so we don't know that yet, but we are given the middle term. So we have the middle term as negative 4x, and we know that the formula for the middle term, because it's a negative, is negative 2 times A times B. All right, is that confusing to anyone?
No.
Yes?
No.
Okay, so that's from the formula. This is what it tells us the middle term equals. We know what A is. We know what A is because we already figured that out, so we can plug that in. But we don't know what B is. That's what we're solving for. So what I'll do is I'll divide each side by negative 2x. Because that's like our knowns, right? Divide them from each side. They cancel out on the right side. On the left side, what's negative 4x divided by negative 2x?
2x.
Because we're solving for what B is.
Oh, so then you have to keep 2 on it.
Yes, we have to get the B by itself. So divide this from each side, the negative 2 times A, which we said was x. What's negative 4x divided by negative 2x?
2.
All right, just a positive 2. So that's what our B equals. Since the formula has this as B squared, I just have to square it. So then my B squared is 4. And that's what goes up here. Does that make sense? Do I need to re-explain?
Yeah.
All right. So we have to figure out what A and B equals in order to fill out these missing terms. Doesn't matter where it is, you have to figure out what A and B equals. We know what A is because we just have to take the square root of the first term. That gives us A. Square root of x squared is x. We're searching for the B term. We don't know what that is. But since we have the middle term, we can basically solve for B. All right, so the middle term equals negative 4x. We know the formula for it is negative 2 times A times B. We already know what A is because we did that in the first step. So solve for B, and we get B is 2. In the formula, it's supposed to be B squared. Questions? All right, let's try the middle one. Number 2, searching for the middle term. We need to figure out what A and B is. What would A be? So you find A by taking the square root of the first term. Square root of 36x squared is 6x. How can I find my B term? Square root of 121, which is 11. So I have my A term, I have my B term. My middle term, what's the formula for my middle term? -2 times A times B. So for this one, it's a little easier when I have to search for the middle term, because now I just have to plug in A, plug in B. You'll probably need a calculator. But what's my middle term going to be? Good, I heard one person say it. Good. So -2 times 6 is 12. 12 times 11 makes it -132, and then the x. Questions? All right, I know we didn't do the factors for number 1. I forgot. We'll do them next. But what's the factors for number 2? What's the sign going to be in the middle? 6x minus your b value, which is 11 squared.
So this would be x squared. Oh no, just x. Minus 4.
One second. So then class for number 1, what would the factors be for number 1? If you have the answer, hold it for a second, let everyone think about it. So this over here follows the a minus b squared. Since this is negative, this will also follow the a minus b squared. So my factors should be x minus 2, because it's a minus b. So my b is here, so it goes here. And then squared. Question? How can I check my answers? FOIL or distribute? All right, one more, solving for the first term. So we don't know what A is. We could figure out what B is. What's the value for B? 12, because B is the square root of your last term. We know that the middle term is 24p, so that can help us solve for what A is. So we know the middle term is 24p. What's the formula for the middle term? 2ab. And it's positive, so it's a positive 2ab. Just rewriting this. We know what the b value is, so we're going to plug that in. What's 2 times 12?
524.
So on the right side, I have 24a. How can I solve for what a is? Good. So I have to isolate the a, divide by 24 on each side. The 24s cancel on the right side. All we have is a. On the left side, the 24s also cancel. So all we have is p. So what is my a value? My a value is 1p. So then that squared is p squared. So what number goes here? 1. Questions about that? And then this is gonna follow the format a plus b squared because this is plus in the middle. So what are my factors? Should just be p plus 12. Because it's just the a, not the a squared, and when you're writing your factors. Questions? All right, you have 3 your turn problems to help you practice, and I'll put those on the board in about 3 minutes. Also, you have a puzzle piece practice. So the 8.05, it's just 5 questions. If you have questions, let me know. But I'll project the answers for the your turn in 3 minutes, and then you have the rest of the time for your puzzle piece. All right, for those of you that did the your turn, I'll put the answers up on the board so that you can check your work. All right, so basically the key here is figuring out what your A values and your B values are. And from there, you can also factor it. So here's the factored answers down here. And you can also FOIL or distribute to check your answers.